All right. Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started and we'll see how it works. So thank you for coming to the first Biosphere Futures webinar. You can see the agenda here on the screen, in which I'll talk for about 5 minutes about what this is and what we hope to achieve with the webinar series. And then this excellent panel of experts from the Urban Resilience to Extremes Network will talk through their sustainable future scenarios approach. We'll take some questions, and then we'll say goodbye until the next time. So my name is Liam Carpenter Urquhart. I'm a PhD student at the Stockholm Resilience Center and the PhD student on the Biosphere Futures project. Um, Biosphere Futures is a database of social ecological scenario studies, um, by which I mean that we collect information about where, when, how, and to what ends people have explored the future using scenario planning and other similar techniques to explore the relationship between people and nature in different communities and contexts around the world. So we collect information like the location, the time the study happened, how far ahead into the future the study looks, what kind of ecosystems it looked at, what kind of participants or sectors of society were included in the study, and lots of other things that you can see on our website at biospherefutures.net. We have collected this information from over 100 studies on every continent and every ecosystem across the world. Um, and yes, and you can read more about this and find a more detailed breakdown of what we have in the database on our open access article on ecology and society, which you can access using the QR code on your screen. Um, and give me a second, please. I'm just going to try to um, bring in the expert that's going to talk after me, who's going to introduce everyone properly. Oh, the sound isn't working. Um, Sorry, folks. Give me a second, please.
I can hear you
Uh,
okay, Liam.
you can hear me okay? Thank you, Timon.
Yeah.
So I'll just go ahead and keep talking.
And I promoted Marta, so she's in there.
Perfect. Thank you, Megan. Like
Thank
Biosphere
you
Future,
so much.
webinar is a community effort. And Marta Berbés is here despite the technical difficulties that tried to stop her. So everything is going great. So I'll go ahead and keep presenting. So like was saying, you can find this information on our open access article, which also includes um, information about the goals that we have for the database, how we hope that it's used, which include enabling people to explore the different ways, the different kinds of futures that have been imagined in different places across the globe, to be inspired by the techniques and methods that other practitioners have used when designing their own studies, to do broad cross-case analysis of what people are doing in different parts of the field, to showcase your own work if you are a practitioner, and to engage with a growing community. Because one of the core goals of Biosphere Future is to create a community of practice in future studies and in social ecological futures specifically. There are a lot of people across the field doing lots of different things, and it's best if we can learn from each other. And this community practice is something that researchers have been calling for 10 years now, including our core partner, Alyssa Oteris Rosas in 2015, and Steve Carpenter and Jenny Seifert in 2016. But creating a community of practice requires convening a community. And so our webinar series, of which this is the first instance, will be convening expert practitioners to talk about issues of interest for the futures community, and providing a kind of look under the hood. We hope that these webinars can give the kind of frank perspectives and details that you might not find in official publications. So today, for our first webinar, the UREx network will be talking workshop design, co-production, and analysis for complex urban futures. So Marta will be introducing everyone properly in just a minute. But for now, I just want to thank you all of the practitioners that'll be talking today for taking the time, and thank everyone in the audience for taking the time to come see us talk. I hope that you'll look out for the next webinar in May or June. And for now, I'll hand over to Marta. So I'll stop sharing, and then Marta, if you can begin sharing your slides, that'll be great.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry. I was so flustered, I couldn't get into Zoom, so I'm glad that we made it work. Let me just take a second to share. All right. Okay. Is this working? I'm gonna jump into there. That's where we should be. Uh, yes. So, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I am Marta Berbés, and I've been part of Biosphere Futures. I lead the urban section, and it is my distinct pleasure to launch alongside Liam and Gary and Jan. This series of dialogues. In one of the intents, I think, as Liam mentioned, is to really create a space where researchers and practitioners can talk a bit more openly and a bit more candidly about the type of work that we do. We welcome everybody that wants to have a conversation about how to use scenarios and future approaches to social ecological systems research. It is also my distinct pleasure to open this series of this dialogue series with good friends and colleagues from the Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainability Research Network, so the UREx for short. And I'm not going to introduce them. I'll introduce them one by one as we go. But the only person that I do want to mention, because she's actually not part of the panel, but was a central part of the scenarios working group, is Tisha Munoz Erickson. She's joining as an audience member because she's a federal employee of the United States with the Forest Service, and so because of that uncertainty, she's not joining as a panelist. But she was definitely part of this, and we might need to ask her for some answers from the audience. One last thing, if you're sort of like already sold on the UREx approach and you want to find out more, all of our scenarios are on the Biosphere Futures database as well. You can find us on the website, and there's like some outputs that I want to highlight in addition to many publications, academic publications. But there's this Resilient Urban Futures, which is an open access book that we published in 2021. There is the guide to scenarios, which is included in the Biosphere Futures resources tab, and also in the UREx website. And as well, I want to point you to what we used to call the Future Cities podcast, but now is the Resilient Futures podcast, which literally has, like, I don't think I'm exaggerating, but like hundreds of episodes on this process that we have led. So I will flash this again at the end, but what we have prepared for today was sort of a bit of a Q&A that I will be leading with the fellow panelists, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to invite the audience. I see that there is quite a large audience, so what I'm going to do is invite you to put questions in the chat. Liam and I will be monitoring, more Liam than me. I will be monitoring the chat. But if you have clarifying questions, then please, by all means, put them, and we'll try to stop the panelists and talk, because like the idea is to have a conversation. All right, so without further ado, I want to bring up Dr. Nancy Grimm. who was the co-director of the UREx, and perhaps Nancy, good to see you. You could talk about what was the UREx and what was it responding to. I'm going to do the slides, so just tell me when.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. My job here is to tell you why we came to the idea of doing these future scenarios for cities and what our rationale was for establishing the UREx. So next slide. Well, I'm sure you all have seen this. It's quite famous. So all of these changes in human activity that have led to trends in the Earth system, many of which that are quite worrying. This next slide, this whole period of the Great Acceleration or the Anthropocene or whatever you want to call it is characterized by rapid change, impacts that compound one another. As a result, the systems are becoming more and more complex. But as a result, we also see increased inequity and then finally increased uncertainty. For example, one case being the non-stationarity problem, where probabilities of extreme events, for example, are changing over time, so we can no longer use the past to predict the future. This is all stuff that everyone knows, I think, but what I really want to focus on in terms of the climate system, please go back, thank you. There, that's good. Are the changes in the climate system that have led to increased frequency and magnitude of extreme events. And these are just graphics of natural disasters globally on the left, and then the United States on the right. And most of these increases are in climate-related extreme events. Next slide. And unfortunately, extreme events is really where people experience climate change. So, it often is the case as well that when we look at the impacts of extreme events, those who are least able to cope are disproportionately affected. This graphic shows you the predicted economic damage from climate change ranked in US counties from lowest to highest per capita income. And you can see that the risk is highest for those in the low income area. Next. So this is the fundamental problem, is basically that extreme events are increasing in frequency, magnitude, and impact, and cities are in positions where they're especially vulnerable to extreme events because people are concentrated there, infrastructure is concentrated there, and so forth. But that risk is unevenly distributed among and within cities. So our question is, how can cities and the communities within them become more resilient to these extreme events? Next. So to start to get at this question, we formed the UREx SRN back in 2014. This is just some statistics about the UREx, but we are researching how to build resilience to extreme events, and we focused on 4 types of extreme events: coastal flooding, extreme heat, drought, and urban flooding. We focused on 9 cities in the United States and Latin America. You can see the cities listed there. There were many institutions involved, many researchers involved. But the thing I wanted to note about those researchers is that they included in each city a team including social scientists, ecologists, and engineers. So immediately interdisciplinary. We trained a lot of people, including graduate fellows and postdocs, and we ran for about 7 years or so. I think there are 2 things that, sort of in terms of our intellectual contribution to the future that we are very proud of. The first of this is sort of building the conceptual framing for social, ecological, technological systems. And the second is the focus of today's webinar, which is the 60 future scenarios that were co-produced with city teams. I have one more slide, which is simply to explain a little bit about the SETS framework. You might hear about it again. But because these of the fact that urban resilience problems are problems of complexity, we really need to have this convergent framework. We started off thinking on the upper right about just the interactions, two-way and three-way interactions between the social, ecological, and technological elements of cities. But we moved to a understanding of this sort of entangled sets, if you will, that's represented in the bottom diagram. It's a helix of intertwined dynamic social, ecological, technological systems. You can read more about that if you're interested in a paper that came out in 2023 by Mike Chester and others. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Nancy. So I think like that is like a nice way of like setting the stage, knowing for those of you who are not familiar what the UREx was responding to, and in how we did that. And for that, I want to bring up David Iwaniak from Georgia State University. And I would love for David, if you can explain how did we approach the future scenarios making.
Thanks, Marta. Thanks, Biosphere Futures. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the future scenarios approach, and as an important part of the UREx project, it was very much thinking about the future. This anticipatory work is very much part of the anticipatory aspect of sets, as Nancy was describing. Next slide. Thanks. And so when we talk about scenarios work, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different folks. And so I want to set the stage a little bit first around what is this kind of big approach that we're looking at when we're thinking about the sustainable future scenarios that we did here. So first, these are co-developed scenarios. And Elizabeth will be talking a lot more about what does that mean to be co-developed, and she'll be describing that. But these are both scenario visions and pathways. So not just future states where the future might unfold to, but how to get there. Actively thinking about what those transitions and transformations might entail, and bringing together different community leaders, decision makers, practitioners, and researchers together as a community to think about this. There's a lot of different reasons and rationale for doing futures work. Specifically, though, while all the futures work can be multifunctional, there's definitely a strong focus here on these 5 bullet points. These ideas of inspiring and promoting transformative change, how to do that, what is the role of futures work in enabling that, to assess desirability of different alternatives, to explore the social, ecological, and technological systems, interactions, conflicts, and trade-offs among the different aspects of embedded in these visions and pathways, explicitly to enhance decision-making capacity and guide long-term planning. So decision-making capacity, both in the short term and guiding long-term planning in the longer, for longer-term planning. This is this idea of we're not just doing these long-term scenarios work for the future. We're doing this to make better decisions today, linking this anticipatory knowledge to action that we're trying to enable through the transformative processes. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the framework. We're actually have developed a number of different types of scenarios across each of these different cities. And I'm going to talk about what these different scenarios are. But I also want to point out that only some of these scenarios were actually co-produced in participatory settings with these different practitioners and community leaders. And so the strategic scenarios here, rather than being co-produced together in workshop settings, what this was done is where we took analysis of governance documents of different framings, and we looked at what their existing governance strategies and goals are. This is important not just to get a baseline understanding of how they're thinking about the future, but it's also a way to acknowledge all of the great work that they've been doing so far in each of these cities, thinking about their own futures and what that looks like. Oftentimes, though, that's, as you can imagine, that's not quite enough. And looking to address looking at the different possible extreme events and disturbances associated with the possible futures and thinking, are these futures that you've developed already sufficient to respond to those? And this is where the adaptive scenarios emerge, where these are co-produced. These are more plausible scenarios in response to extreme events. Then in looking at those also, we can push a little forward, leaning more into this kind of normative side, thinking, well, is this enough? Is our response in these adaptive scenarios sufficient? And this makes space for these transformative scenarios where we're focusing on more desirable outcomes, radical departures from the status quo. Next slide, please. And so across these 9 cities, we've developed a huge number of scenarios, 60 plus scenarios. Embedded within those scenarios, of course, are thousands of transition pathways. We've actually added cities since the original work and additional scenarios within these cities. So it's the network of the scenarios has definitely still been rapidly growing. What I want to do is I want to move around these initial core cities, though, to give you a glimpse of what some of these futures looked like, what they were talking about. Next slide, please. So, of course, these are, like I said, thousands of transition pathways associated across multiple different scenarios. So I'm going to be very much kind of oversimplifying some of the narratives that are going on. But I do want to describe for you what were some of the dominant narratives that came from these adaptive and transformative scenarios that were generated. So Syracuse, for example, a lot of their work focused on smart cities, the role of technologies, and smart sensors, smart city approaches to reimagine what their city might look like. New York City, on the other hand, focused a lot more across every single one of their scenarios on thinking about justice, but not just any form of justice. A strong focus on procedural justice was associated with that. Baltimore, there was a strong focus on connectivity throughout the different scenarios, a large flood event just before some of the participatory processes that we did early on. Definitely had them initially thinking about hydrologic connectivity, but not just limited to hydrologic connectivity, or thinking about connectivity, the social connectivity very much, and biodiversity connectivity throughout the region. Miami, Florida. In the US, you can probably not be too surprised. They were thinking about, they were really focusing on sea level rise, not only their adaptation scenarios, all of their transformative scenarios very much featured what is this new relationship with the coast going to look like for Miami. In San Juan, there was a strong focus on agency. Autonomy and power. Yes, there was different conversations around food security, power security, but the largest focus on agency was around governance and reimagining at different scales what that might look like. Valdivia, Chile, took a very classic eco-city imaginary and transformed it in a quite unique way, presenting what I think is the first ever I've seen kind of wetland city, eco-city kind of hybridized imaginary. Hermosillo, Mexico, focusing on a livable city imaginary here, but in this case, across all of their scenarios, very much focusing on reimagining governance, especially governance to protect the most vulnerable and marginalized individuals and to address corruption. Portland did something quite interesting here in their city. They wanted to reimagine what new governance structures and processes looked like. And so fundamentally, for across every single one of their scenarios, they started with the idea of what might new governance and structures look like if we were to arrange them, if they were meant to provide equity, justice, sustainability, and resilience. And that was a core concept that, of course, then emerged throughout all their different futures. And now now how do we do this? What does it look like in all the different settings? I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth Cook to talk about the co-production process.
Hi, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Cook. Marta, sorry, I didn't know if you wanted to go first.
No, just like me, try not to move the mouse too much, but move it enough. Anyhow, yes, Elizabeth Cook, and she's gonna be talking about the co-production process. Go right ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Marta and Liam, for inviting us to share today. I am going to be speaking about who was involved in that process that David just described to develop the scenarios and what the co-production process looked like a little bit in our project. So next slide. The co-production process in our project was primarily centered around these workshops that we co-organized with local partners in each of the cities. And so you can see just even from these images that they happened in really different spaces in different cities, sometimes in community centers, sometimes in a more formal conference room setting. And they involved different partners. Next slide, please. It involved everyone, non-academic partners, all the way sometimes from community members and community leaders to more government agency decision maker individuals who participated in different capacities in the work. And we engaged people in small groups to think about and co-develop these future scenarios that David just described to you. And I want to talk a little bit about what that co-production process, why we focus on this co-production process. Go ahead, Marta. So this is a figure from Galafassi et al. From 2018, and I really like it as a way to describe what the co-production process looks like and why it's so important. So if you think of this kind of as a timeline from the beginning of the process through to the end, we start in the co-production process with asking everybody to kind of unravel their own individual assumptions about what the current challenges are and what the future challenges are and where we should be. And as we work through the process, those unraveled assumptions start to mesh back together and ravel into new forms of knowledge and new ideas about what the solutions in the future might look like, especially when we're thinking about these long-term futures that David described. Next slide. And the thing that I think is really important about this, and the figure shows really nicely, is that it allows space for coming up with new, novel, innovative ideas as we kind of unravel our own assumptions and think about engaging with other people in new ways about what those solutions might look like. It makes space for bringing in really diverse perspectives. So as I mentioned, we were working with community members and community leaders, as well as decision makers in the city. And sometimes those perspectives do not always align and there can be tensions there. And so it gives room for having those conversations and thinking about what the future will look like and developing these kind of new and shared meanings about what those future solutions might look like. Next slide, please. And the idea here is that by going through this process and thinking together and working together to co-develop these or co-produce these future visions, we're not only creating new ideas, but we're also enhancing the credibility and the legitimacy of them so that there's the movement behind it, some pressure behind it to actually put them in place and make them real solutions that might actually work if they can be implemented going forward. And we do this kind of through, partly engaging with, I think this image is nice, it shows some of the visualizations that come out of the workshop setting where we're drawing together at tables in small groups, but then we also work with designers and artists to help visualize what that future might look like in different ways through sketches as well as more computer animated versions. Next slide. And I just want to acknowledge that this is a challenging process. It doesn't always go smoothly, and we're coming to the table with really different expectations and time commitments and the amount of resources that we have to give and what we want to get out of it. And so this process it takes a long time. We initiate it quite early, or we tried to initiate it quite early in each city, working with a local community partner, both in an academic setting and ideally, if we could, in a non-academic partner, to help us think about what are the key goals of that particular city or neighborhood where we were working and developing these future visions, and coming to some consensus about what is the commitment and to our time and effort that we're going to be contributing here, and sharing through active listening and transparent communication, trying to get to some shared goals and timeline, and really focusing on developing a shared rapport, a strong rapport and trust before we even get to the workshop setting, so that when all of the partners come into that workshop setting to develop these future scenarios, everyone hopefully feels that we are there in kind of in shared collaboration for creating more resilient future scenarios for their city. Next slide. Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks, Elizabeth. So I want to bring up now Leilani Minetti, also from Georgia State University, and she's going to be really focusing now on talking about the kind of like nuts and bolts of what we do in those workshops. I know that there was a question on the chat about how we analyze that, so we're kind of like doing like presenting our process as it goes, usually chronologically. So we're going to be moving after Leilani to the data analysis. And if we're not clear, please feel free to repost the question. But I'll leave it to Leilani now.
Thank you, Marta. Hi, everyone. Now, just a brief overview of the scenario development process. Since each network depends on context, of course, we do try to follow these steps for comparability. Marta, you can put the next slide, and you can just put the whole process on for simplicity. Now, when we think about the future of our cities, we're often focused on immediate challenges. But what if we took a step back and asked, what would a resilient, sustainable, and just city look like in the year 2100, and how do we get there? So that's how we start the process going. But as a first step, we first need to build this vision for the future. We need to understand how we got to where we are today. Now, in those small groups that Elizabeth mentioned, the participants start collectively identifying key historical events and decisions that have shaped this city's trajectory, including social, ecological, and technological shifts that influence the present. Now, from there, we ask, what does a sustainable, resilient, and just city look like? And to do this, participants start developing a bold vision, outlining overarching goals and objectives that would make that future possible. But since a vision alone is not enough, we then ask the groups to delve into the strategies and actions, and where plausible, even targets that are needed to achieve these objectives. So here we consider, where should these strategies take place in the city? When do they need to happen? Who needs to be involved? What institutional or governance barriers need to be overcome? And also very important is looking at who benefits and who might lose out. Now, finally, we bring these ideas together in a narrative exercise, imagining or having the groups imagine what their daily life in this envisioned 2100 city looks like. So this makes the future tangible and allows participants to step into the world that they have themselves co-produced. So this approach turns abstract sustainability goals into concrete, actionable pathways, and we use it as a tool to not only help us and the communities plan for these uncertain futures, but also helps to ensure that that transition is equitable and just. Now, for the next slide, the outputs, as Marta was saying, they come, the raw data, for example, it's in various form, and it includes the goals, strategies, maps, timelines, narratives, recordings, and notes. And sometimes it captures more structural planning elements, and other times it's more about the creative visioning. These are then synthesized by the various people across the network into models, qualitative, multi-criteria assessments, visualizations, and renderings, to name just a few. And then these refined outputs are used, like I said, in a variety of ways. Again, so that we can all in our own way, whether it's students, whether it's researchers, architects, designers, etc., policymakers, all to collectively develop strategies for more just and adaptive cities. But I'll hand back to you, Marta.
Thank you. I actually was going to do this slide, but it's a testament to how good we have coordinated that you can just throw a slide and people know what to say about it. Um, so I wanted to talk now about data, which was one of the questions, and I'm going to bring Timon McPherson, who led the quantitative data analysis, and he'll be talking about the modeling outputs and the visualization outputs, and then I'll be talking about some of the qualitative outputs as well.
Great, thank you,
Oh,
Marta.
sorry.
Right, so as Leilani was mentioning, there is a host of information that's produced across all of these scenarios. And so as Marta will talk about in a few minutes as well, what we wanted to do was make sense of this information in a number of different ways. And one of them is in thinking about the future and how we could use quantitative tools, modeling tools, visualization tools as a way of understanding those visions, those goals, those targets and strategies, and what they might actually look like. So I'm sort of most taken in some cases with the renderings that were done and how we brought those back into the workshops. I noticed the question in the Q&A from Loan about how these are brought back. And one of the main goals of producing some of the outputs, which I'll talk to you about for a minute here, is to bring those back into those communities and see how they can be brought into actions on the ground. As David mentioned, not only long-term futures, but strategies that can be put in place now, targets that can be set, and we can start to think about how we work from the present to that moment. So these are both mapped outputs, visualizations, et cetera. Just to walk you through that method a little bit, on the left, you can see some actual maps and timelines that were drawn in those scenario workshops, what David was introducing. And so we had to code those for specific targets, for specific strategies. And then our team extracted out ones that had a measurable or quantitative component that we thought that we could do something with, especially in a spatial way, right? So we brought these into land use land cover modeling environment where we could say, okay, here you're looking at on the right an example from San Juan, Puerto Rico, and one of the scenarios there was really thinking about resilience to coastal flooding, along with a couple others I'll show you in just a moment. And there's a number of strategies that were developed. So I won't repeat some of the things that David said, but what we really wanted to do was understand, okay, if you were going to retreat from the coast, how would that land use change? Would it convert into vegetation or wetlands? Would it be, are there certain areas where the urban component would be higher emphasized? And there's definitely a focus here of thinking about food production areas, dedicated food production areas, dedicated forest areas, areas that are made safe on the coast in the coastal resilience scenario. And so as much as those are targets and strategies that are just sort of written down in text form or articulated in drawings or drawn on a map, literally with a shaded boundary, like you can see in the middle left figure, where participants in the workshop said, no, here is a really ideal spot for us to think about resilience to flooding or as a food security hub. Those spatial translations and specific goals and targets, we then translated into a quantitative environment where we could project out by the end of the century what land use or land cover might change if those strategies and targets and goals were put into place, right? And literally do that every year from the present all the way up to 2100, and then say, now let's look and see what that really might mean if all of these strategies and targets were hit, and what that future would, in a sense, really look like if we take a look from a bird's eye view looking down on the landscape. Next slide. Now, once you build out that quantitative environment for these scenarios, we can compare and contrast them and ask a bunch of questions. So on the left, you can see 3 different scenarios that were developed in the San Juan context. And here we have a connected city scenario, with coastal flooding and resilience scenario, and a food and energy security scenario. And one of the questions we wanted to ask was, how are they similar? How are they different? Where are the overlaps between where the workshop participants came up with different visions, and are those visions similar in various ways, especially when we think them in the context of resilience, which is one of the sort of uber questions of this entire UREx project, right? So on the right, and it's a little hard to see, so I'll walk you through it. We did what we sort of commonly referred to as like stress testing the scenarios. And so we said, all right, let's imagine that you have a coastal flood situation happen, and you project this out towards the end of the century in 2080. And let's ask, even if it is not the coastal flood scenario, but it's the connected city scenario or the food and energy security scenario, how well do they all do in this 2080 future when they need to be resilient to flooding in addition to whatever those core strategies and goals were, for example, in the connected city or food and energy security scenarios. So that's what you're looking at on the right, a comparison in this bar chart of different land cover type areas, like low density urban areas. That's going to be in like the pinkish zone. High density urban is going to be the darker pink area. Bare soil is going to be the brown area. That's where some of the cultivated areas and agricultural areas there, or like mangroves on the edges. And then we could essentially use elevation data and some modeling approaches to say, all right, how well would a food and energy security scenario also fare in terms of its ability to provide flood resilience? And where can you start to see some synergies in these different types of visions that were produced? So this is just an example. There's a lot of other questions that we can ask once you bring it into a quantitative environment. There's actually many papers yet to be written out of this, and some that are being produced because it's so rich in terms of information. So it's just incredible how these visions and targets were able to be worked within this quantitative environment, and then how we could bring that back into the scenario workshops so that we could test them again and say, is this really the vision that you had? Next slide. I think I just have two quick slides here. One of the goals was, as I mentioned, is to think about what that future looks like based on those goals, targets, and strategies produced in the workshops. And when you say look like it, we sort of realized that we needed to imagine this in lots of ways, right? Renderings, spatial modeling, and land cover, land use information, but also bring it into an environment where you can play with it. So data visualization was a key part of the UREx work. And on the next slide, and this is something you can play around with while we're talking discussion or afterwards, we developed a data visualization platform that we now call Ocellus. The link is at the bottom. Feel free to log in. You can click on the left where right now it shows under Data Viz platform, it shows Phoenix. You can click there through any of the cities that we brought in, and you'll find loads of information. Some of that information is fundamental present day information about what we know about the sort of sets structure of the city. Some of the social important variables like population density or socioeconomic information for some of the cities. Some of the ecological information like current land covers or where we have an understanding of current heat risk or flood risk or something like that, as well as some of the technological or infrastructural information such as buildings and building footprints and where the roads are, for example, or vacant land, or even bus stops that we might be concerned about because we're thinking about future heat and how to protect people during their transition in the mornings to work or to school, and thinking about bus stops and heat and future visions for resilience in that context. And then we also have these modeled out future scenarios and what those look like from a spatial perspective as well, which you can see under future scenarios. So I invite you to take a look, play around with this, with some of the outputs. And I'll just end with saying that we found that this is really important for not only bringing back into workshop context information that now we can ask, okay, is this the vision? We can start to stress test those visions in multiple ways. But we found that this kind of information allows for those sort of working out of these visions in so many different other contexts, including, as I'm sure we'll get to at the end of this presentation, ways that the UREx project has been impactful and sustainable and sustainability planning, resilience plans, actual plans that were generated in multiple cities that learned from some of the work that we produced here. So thank you, Marta. I'll hand it back to you.
There is actually a clarifying question, Timon, in terms of the modeling approaches that you use for mapping and project the scenarios. So it's in the chat. Do you want to answer that right away?
Yeah, I'll give a quick answer.
Yeah.
There's multiple models involved, depending on what we're talking about. So I'll just answer how do you project land use, land cover? Basically, we took those targets and strategies and we developed rules in a modeling environment where we can sort of project forward. So essentially, we could say, all right, if everybody needs to be 10 minutes from a park, use that population density information. You can draw buffers around that, and then we can sort of basically reproject the land cover to say, okay, now we're going to have parks with this type of characteristic, nearby all populations. That's one example. Another example might be in a coastal retreat scenario where we'd say, okay, so for up to 100 meters from the coast, all around the coastline for a coastal city, that's going to be transformed from um, an urban land cover and land use to a wetland or vegetative land use. And so then we would, literally code the model to make that kind of change. And then because this is a projection model, the goal is to hit that at the timing of wherever that target was set. So was that a 2050 target, a 2080 target? And then allow the model to change from the present, that land cover and land use to change from the present until you hit that target. And then we can actually look at, and basically this is kind of an approach in a quantitative way to starting to get at backcasting, how you can backcast from those targets and then say, where do we need to be in 5 years or 10 years to show that we're on that pathway to the future? And that's one of the benefits of some of these quantitative approaches. That may not answer all the questions, but happy to do some more in the Q&A.
Yeah, so thanks so much for that. So now it's my turn as part of the data analysis. So Timon's group did all the models and the quantitative, but there are parts of the scenarios and there's parts of the visions and the inspirations for the futures that are hard to capture with models. In specifically when we're talking about the complex dimensions of the futures, things like some aspects of resilience, of equity and sustainability, we wanted to explore this from a qualitative perspective as well. And so this group was in charge of looking at each of these dimensions. And so, but we wanted to look at it not so much in terms of indicators, finding indicators that would tell us how the vision would evolve into the future, but we wanted to look at mechanisms because we figured that the indicators in some ways, if you're looking at 2100, would that indicator still be meaningful? And so instead of looking for specific indicators, we wanted to look at those visions and say, do these visions contain mechanisms to increase resilience, to increase equity, and to increase sustainability, and consider those as processes. And so we adopted a deductive approach where we looked at the literature and we said, well, equity, there's distributional aspects of equity, there's procedural aspects of equity, recognitional aspects of equity. Are these present in this specific vision? And we did the same with resilience. We use Biggs et al. 7 principles, or an expanded version of the 7 principles for building resilience. And for sustainability, we use the Sustainable Development Goals. And the point was really to say, what are the mechanisms that are present? What are the strengths? And maybe what are things that this vision is not considering? And maybe they don't want to consider, but maybe it would be a good thing to kind of like push them in that direction more. And so we did the assessment, and then we used a Likert scale, and we turned them into some sort of semi-quantitative measure. And on their own, they're not meaningful, but it's meaningful when you actually compare the assessments, the qualitative assessments for the different scenarios and for the different cities. So you can see that like some scenarios are connected on mobile. Well, in terms of like their resilience, they really looked at connectivity, not surprisingly. So there will be like different emphasis depending on the visions. One thing, and I'll be brief, well, I think we're doing good on time. But one of the things in doing this qualitative assessment that we were able to do in Phoenix, we actually had 2 sets of visions, and some of the visions were created at the regional level, and some of the visions were created in what is called in Phoenix a village, which is really like a neighborhood or a borough. And so we actually were able to use these qualitative methods to compare how those visions were matching with one another. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of the analyses, but I'll show you the one that was more striking in terms of having mechanisms for equity, what turned out was that in all cases, South Mountain Village, which is the neighborhood, had a lot more mechanisms for all sorts of, for distributional, for procedural, for recognitional equity. Whereas the regional visions had some for distributional, but really were not thinking about, say, recognitional equity. And this was not surprising because the South Mountain Village is a historical disenfranchised neighborhood. So they really care about how, in their visions, they wanted to honor their tradition, they wanted to honor their culture, they care about having their voices being represented. And so like you can see how those play out in the visions. And in doing this work, one of the things that is interesting is that you can see how, if we think that these visions are describing some sort of pathway for change, some theory of change or some pathway to the future, like how these pathways might act in ways that are synergistic, complementary, or antagonistic, and how that might play out in their incidence in policy. So I'll stop there and I'll bring it back to Elizabeth to actually talk about some of the policy incidents that these scenarios have had.
Thanks, Marta. And I would love to invite everyone on the panel to share here, but I'll start us off if others, and then others can jump in if they have other examples to share. So go ahead. And I saw this was a question in the chat too, which of course is a super important question and something that we were thinking about from the beginning. And our goal was really to think about how we can link these visions to actionable changes on the ground. And I showed this in my earlier slide, this sketch of what the future looked like in one of our Phoenix visions for a more green and connected city. And we really did want and intended that through the engagement with the diversity of partners that we brought to the table to co-develop these scenarios, that we would be able to kind of seed the ideas. So understanding that it's a long process, they're not necessarily going to go out and be implemented the next day, but seed the ideas and for kind of new and existing initiatives to move forward perhaps in different ways. Next slide. And just to give a couple of examples that I have on the slide here, some of the ways that happened in different cities was, so I worked closely we all worked closely in Valdivia in southern Chile. And there, just as we started this project, they were also releasing their first sustainability plan for 2030. But kind of it was a tenuous plan because a lot of the practitioners in Valdivia, and by practitioners, I should say the decision makers who were sitting in the municipal government, they really were quite skeptical that climate change was going to impact Valdivia. They weren't certain that this was something that they needed to worry about. The sustainability plan was being developed in collaboration with the Inter-American Development Bank. So it wasn't necessarily coming from the municipal government, although they had participated some in the development of it. They were skeptical of climate change. And so through this process and kind of talking through some of these scenarios that we worked with them on, and definitely, I mean, Dr. Olga Barbosa, who's based in southern Chile, was the main driver of this, kind of having these conversations and thinking about the future. I think we started to see some slow shifts in their priorities for addressing climate change. And it wasn't overnight, but we started to see implementation of more ordinances to protect the wetlands, to help, David mentioned the wetlands scenario from Valdivia to protect the wetlands within that area. And so not to say, and I'm not giving all attribution of that success to this project, but I think through those conversations, we saw some real progress. Similarly, in Phoenix, some of the scenarios that were developed in Phoenix that David initiated very at the beginning of this project were developed over a long time period of 2 years. So we were bringing the same partners back regularly to engage in these conversations about the future of Phoenix and develop these different scenarios. And some of those partners were people who then went forward and developed the Phoenix Sustainability Plan for 2050. And we start to see some of the ideas that were discussed in those scenarios actually showing up in that sustainability plan as a priority for the city, being, it's written out there in the documents. And then one last example that I'll give, and I'll invite others to share as well, is Timon and I both work closely with the New York panel on climate change. And in the last New York panel on climate change report that was just released last year, we were able to engage some of the scenarios that were developed through this process in a chapter that was specifically focused on New York City's future. And so kind of putting it there where there's a lot of engagement with the city of New York and the decision makers within that space and the communities who are thinking about the future to see these visions. They not only help develop them, but then to kind of be reminded of them and see them as part of this report that comes out, thinking about the future of the city. So I wonder if others have examples that they would like to share, or any other points there.
I have something to add. Cook, I love how you described it, and to kind of help paint that picture, I actually think a lot of the the support and link to actions was a lot more kind of diffuse and hard to put a finger on. I like your word of attribution. I mean, sure, there's definitely situations where practitioners have come to us and have said, oh, in the developing of this plan, we used this scenario and thinking how you were thinking about heat and thinking about the distribution of trees in Phoenix, for example, around pathways connecting bus routes, to bus stops, etc. We've definitely had people. There's a lot of examples, of course, like that. But where I've seen some of the biggest impacts has been more of this kind of process-based stuff. Examples like in Hermosillo, where folks from the planning department have come back and said how they changed the way they engage with communities through the kind of co-producing this work with us, or in San Juan, the development of new collective action communities of practice in the neighborhood to do active counter planning for what's been done. And so a lot of this kind of is a lot more kind of process based sometimes, rather than something that you can point to a particular kind of at this particular site, it's different because of that. And so kind of I wanted to make sure that it's emphasized.
Yeah, thank you, David. I agree. That's a great point. Sorry, I lost my mouse. Oh, go ahead, Nancy.
Yeah, I was just going to say that going back to the sets framing, I think at least my experience is some of the practitioners that we worked with really appreciated having that framing as something that they could sort of draw on. And we made some really simple, kind of cheat sheets about what we mean by sets and why it's important. And I think there was an appreciation for that. It's often the case that planners, policymakers they'll grab on to some term and then it gets used in really bizarre ways. Like we've explored how practitioners and researcher and others are thinking about the word resilience, and it's just all over the map, right? But I think that there was some appreciation for that framing.
Do we want to answer some of the questions that are pertinent to this now, Marta? I see Raphael's questions, for example, fits right in here, or do you want to save them for afterwards?
No, I think that so basically we sort of are concluding in terms of like kind of like presenting material, and we still have maybe 20 minutes or a bit less like for questions from the audience. I did want to perhaps offer a chance, because we have talked about trying to be open and try to be a bit candid about this process, and so I wanted to offer a chance if anybody wanted to talk about oopsie moments, like moments when we realize that something was unexpected, and how we might have pivoted or what we did about it. So I want to bring that to the group. If you have and perhaps what you can do is that you can think about it in while we answer some of the questions that are on the chat. And I would also like to maybe come back to some of the questions. I'm not sure that we answer, like some of them, I know that I was typing fast. So how about we do that? So first, there's a question about if this could be used for modeling rural environments. I would say yes, of course. And I don't know if anybody wants to go into more detail. I guess this is a question maybe for Timon. Oh, Timon is typing. Okay. So that question will be answered. Rafael is asking about the process of co-production and how is the research team following up with community partners and other stakeholders today? Okay, so that's a really good question. David, is that what you wanted to talk about?
No, but I'm happy to. I was actually going to wonder about I was going to ask you about the transformation stuff, but I'll do this instead. Sure. Following up.
I can talk.
So following up, I think is really a really good question. So I want to say, in all honesty, mixed bags, mixed bag. I want to say so. The way we did this is that we had really strong on the ground folks in each of these cities engaging with UREx and as part of this scenario work. And in many of these instances, we're still really connected to the work that we're doing in these cities. However, in some cases where you have faculty members moving from one city to another, or you have, just kind of various shifts, things happen within a network. These are dynamic places. You if you lose connections with kind of the central figure, the charismatic actor that was holding everyone together, then things have maybe not completely gone away, but the connections gets a lot more loose and harder to maintain. And in those cases, they're definitely very much weaker. And so we're very much connected, working every day in some of these cities, and it's kind of dispersed. So some of us are working closer in some cities than others also. So it's kind of hard to kind of connect that, to kind of give you the full picture. But in short, most cities, yes, some cities has been hard, especially due to the dynamic nature of networks. But it's also quite more distributed than it was. Because the centralized network is more distributed in itself.
Great. Do you want to answer what you wanted to answer initially?
Oh, no.
Okay.
I forgot. Probably, but I forgot. Sorry.
Good. I see, and again, I see a question from Luna Kirfan. Hi, Luna. Talking about the challenges of working together as a team, and having to bridge different types of knowledge. And I wonder if somebody wants to take that. I'll give it just to the panel and unmute yourselves. If somebody's unmuting, or you're not fast enough. Oh, okay, Nancy, go ahead.
Oh, well, I think it helps that we all like each other. So that's something. And from my perspective, it's working with smart people who are early in their careers. It's really, really helpful. But that's not a really great answer. I think there are definitely challenges. I think that we experience more of the challenges of working with different sectors, less so than working across disciplines, because I think that's something, for the work that we've been doing for many years, we have a lot of practice at.
I can sorry, Nancy, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I'm finished. Go ahead.
I'll just add, and this also answers the question above from Raphael about people's willingness to engage in the process. So building on Nancy's point about challenges working with folks from different sectors, but I think also an example from working in some of our cities is that Nancy set up really nicely the project, and that we were a team, a large team for the whole UREx project of not just social scientists and ecologists, but also engineers. And actually, so engaging, we had a really committed kind of core team that you see on this webinar, plus a few additional folks like Tisha was mentioned, who were really committed to doing this scenario work and excited about thinking about future transitions and those components. But some of our colleagues in the UREx project who are academics were a little more skeptical about, like, why are we developing these future scenarios? I don't quite get, like, what's the point of this? And so as we engaged with our teams in each of the various 9 cities that we worked in, it also took some convincing on our part that it was worth their time to engage in the process. And it, as I kind of alluded to, it was a long process of planning the workshops and getting together their partners and convincing them that it was a worthwhile effort for their partners that they've already been building trust with to participate in this process. So there was some unwillingness from the academics. And then also, once we got in the room with the non-academic partners, there was always a question that came up of, why are we thinking about 2100 or 80 years from now and not what we can do tomorrow to address the challenges that we face? They, you know, people wanted, understandably, to think about what was most prevalent in their current lives and how to address those challenges. And so there was also some tension with, how do we address both that long-term future vision, which from our perspective gives us kind of a place to work towards, a goal that we're working towards and thinking about how to get there. So we're not just moving about without an end goal that is shared and in a positive future, but also recognizing the current challenges and thinking about how to address those at the same time. And that's part of the transitions process that Leilani discussed in her overview.
Thank you so much. Actually, Nancy, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yes, I have just a sort of a learning, I guess it will be, or maybe a moment of kind of clarity, and I think it's really important to keep in mind when you're engaging in co-production that you can't go in with this sort of, this is the rigid idea of what has to happen. And I think we learned that in several instances. We did have a structure for the way that we organize these workshops that Leilani went through, but there's a lot of pre-workshop activities that went into trying to decide, how we were going to focus at each city on different themes that were these small groups that were in the workshop. And one of the things we did, and I remember this particularly for Phoenix, that we decided to have a pre-workshop World Cafe. We invited a bunch of people that might be coming to the workshop or not. And really just had this idea. We went in with these ideas about, these are the themes that will be important. And what actually happened was that the people who came to the workshop just sort of rebelled against the themes that we had pre-ideas. We wanted to develop those themes with them, but they, a small cluster of them decided to just rebel and go and say, we need this theme. We need this, what they called the equity district. And this is directly related to what Marta was saying we found for this neighborhood scale workshop, that they really wanted to focus on how they could think about equity, all aspects of equity. And so and then there were certain themes that we had in mind that they nixed. We allowed them to sort of vote at the end of the World Cafe on what they really wanted to see. And so we ended up with a new framework. And I think that the lesson is really just that you have to be, if you're really co-producing, you can't come in with your preconceived idea about what's going to actually happen. You need to really listen to what the people you're working with are hoping to do. And one other comment I wanted to make, and this came up in one of the questions about having people think about the distant future. I think it's very freeing. When I've done some work with kind of, like what can we do in the next 3 years, which is usually the framework that people have for planning. And it's often so constrained by what they think they're allowed to do that they can't think outside the box. And so it's somewhat freeing to say, let's think 80 years into the future.
Do you want another lesson, Marta?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
So I'll tell you a little story about a lesson that I learned, and it sounded like it sounded like it's something that I knew, but it actually wasn't. It was actually something that I learned. Um, and this is a story from some of the Phoenix work. And let me set the stage. So we've been doing these co-production workshops for a while now. Maybe we were a year into the 2-year process, and we were keeping these. We were doing these every other month, and we were taking up a whole entire Friday every other month. And the chief sustainability officer at the time was asking me, how we are, because he was thinking about the work that he's doing to bridge across different agencies and departments, and how the difficulty is to kind of keep an agenda running across such a long period of time when people kind of come and go and leave, and when they can choose to come or not. And he said, I see what you did here. But here's the little trick. Actually, I didn't know I was doing it at the time. And so I learned this from here. And he says, I saw what you did here. He says, early on, you really were speaking to every single community leader or every single agency director or every single nonprofit associate director, and you're speaking to what they care about in their job right now. Before you started moving into a larger collective conversation around what are we trying to do collaboratively together. And I actually didn't know that we did that. But I thought, wow, what great insight. I'm going to take that as something that, that I've now learned. And I definitely think about that and incorporate that in the work that I do now.
Thanks for sharing that, David. I see there's a couple of questions still in the chat, and we're getting a bit closer to time. Maybe Mark's question, and there was oh, he has moved, but I believe there was like a question that somebody was asking about. Well, how do you convince people to do this? Like, especially, people who are hesitant, not just about the value, but about, like the outcomes. Like, what would it suggest if like we dream of much better futures that are not reflected in the present? And if I can take a stab at that, I mean, I think that's the entire, like, for me, and others might have different ideas about what the visioning process does. But to me, one of the things that the visioning does is like it kind of like shakes up and disturbs the present. And one of the things that we do in the workshops is like when we start the workshops, and Nancy alluded to this a little bit too, we don't say, oh, tell us what, like can be or could be or should be. Just tell us what ought to be. Like, what is the future that we deserve? And start from there. And that's what we do long-term futures, because it is free. And if you are imagining things and then you look at the present and it looks nothing like the present, then I hope that people feel uncomfortable. I hope that they start questioning what they're doing. And so in some ways it is a hard sell for people who are really embedded in the status quo. So for politicians who are, as Mark mentioned, like promoting the party line. But that's where you also have to find, hopefully, like people that can leverage power, that can move things along, that are willing to reimagine better futures for the cities. I don't know if there's other takers on that.
I could add just a little bit on that, Marta. I think Elizabeth mentioned this a little bit earlier, but at least for me, a good example is maybe you guys don't make these assumptions, but one might assume that folks who are working within city government may have some not only resistance to thinking long term, but even resistance to sort of radical visions, right? Or even, like you said, Marta, starting with what do we deserve? Um, I don't think I make that assumption all the time, but sometimes I wonder, like, how much tolerance is there for this kind of visioning process? And what we found in the case of the New York City 2100 scenarios work that Elizabeth was co-leading as well, uh, is an outgrowth of the UREx work, but it was really incredible how over, I think, around 30 different agencies, city, state, and federal, all came together, right? All of these workshop participants who were so excited, to Nancy's point, to be able to think long term because they just don't get the opportunity to do that on a day-to-day basis, right? You're sort of ruled by the tyranny of the present. Secondly, to be able to start from that point you mentioned, Marta, from the future, and to say, what does a resilient, equitable, sustainable New York look like? And how exciting it is to be able to imagine that, and even in a radical way, right? And I was impressed that the governance side of that visioning was one of the strongest, most powerful things that came up by city agency folks, right? Not by academics, not by the community members in this case, and really taking on this idea of, like, how do we radically change governance so that we can have an equitable city that's truly inclusive for all, while achieving things like uh, you know the city doesn't suffer when there's a heat wave anymore. And any suffering that might happen is, like, equitable, right? I thought it was just kind of amazing that this does happen, actually, that there is not just tolerance, but a real excitement to be able to do this kind of work, to be able to imagine radical futures, to be able to imagine longer term futures, and then think really strategically how you can work backwards from that to the present, so that when they go back to their jobs or back to their community visioning processes, you have this target in mind and these sets of goals in mind. And it just continues to inspire me.
Maybe just one quick addition to what Timon said, which is such a great point, is that the other piece of that we definitely heard in New York, and I think also in the other cities as well, is it was an opportunity for folks to engage with each other when they don't normally get to engage with each other. So people from the Department of Transportation who think about green space and think about how to, improve um, the flood resilience and the heat resilience of the land that they manage, got a chance to speak with people from the Parks Department and people from the Health Department and people from the Office of the budgeting office, and think about, like, well, how do we do this? We're all working towards the same goal. How do we do it together? So I think that was another big benefit that came out of that process.
Okay, just one more question. How do we address uncertainty when designing and modeling scenarios? What are some general principles? Timon, do you want to take it? Noticing that we have, can you give the 2-minute answer?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, okay, great question. I think there's a number of things to talk about, and so I'll keep it short. But one is, how do you deal with uncertainty in the modeling itself? And then also, how do you communicate it? So one is, we don't want to mask over the uncertainty and any type of, say, projection that we might do, whether it's a climate projection from the climate models, or whether it's a land use, land cover projection based on targets that come out of workshops. We have to know that it's futures that we're talking about and not a future, and that even when we work out, say, a quantitative approach to projecting, that there's going to be uncertainty with that, and that there's assumptions, and that, especially with modeling, models are models, right? They're not the truth. And so that's why I say it's not just about how you do the work. And there's probably an important methodological question we could dive into here with some more time. And I'd say take a look at the modeling chapter in the UREx scenarios just for a starting point, in the Resilient Urban Futures book, sorry, and some of our other examples. But it's not just the methods that you use to deal with uncertainty, it's about how you communicate it, and then making sure that we're communicating in a way around a range of possible futures, and that the goal here, whatever you might set out that might look very concrete, is really about how to articulate these visions in multiple ways. and how we can imagine those visions and come up with those imaginaries that we can really be inspired by as a way to working from our present to that future that we want and that we deserve.
The 10-second add to that is another aspect of this uncertainty that I wanted to add is this idea of the more transformative these scenarios were. As you can imagine, the modeling team had harder time. It was more difficult for them to figure out ways to embrace and represent those transformative changes. And that's yet another form of where that uncertainty came into play and what Timon is talking about.
Thank you so much. We have 2 minutes left, and I want to let Liam close this. But round of applause for the panel. Thank you so much.
Yes, I'll reiterate the thanks to the panel. Thank you again for your time and your reflections. This was highly entertaining for me, so I really want to thank you again. And thank you to the audience as well. Thanks again for your patience at the beginning of the session today. And we hope to see you again at the next Biosphere Futures webinar, which will again be happening sometime in May and June. We'll be sending out more information via our various social media channels when we get closer to that. So I think that we are ready to let you go. And we look forward to the next time. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks all. Take care.